Now we're going to be looking at the short-term causes of the war in the Pacific based off of the actions of the Japanese. We've seen that Japan evolved from a very isolated nation into becoming a world power that had to be recognized and considered by other countries. In the years after World War I and in the 1920s, Japan had a lot of internal issues in trying to determine who was going to lead the military and the government. But by the end of the 1920s, with all the different prime ministers of that decade failing in different areas, the 1930s was going to be more of a decade where the army was going to reassert itself and gain even more influence from what it did have prior to that. So sometimes the decade of the 1930s is known as the Dark Valley of Japan. And in these years, you can see here the things that I have highlighted, that the army was becoming more and more powerful over the government. Japan was becoming increasingly aggressive, and part of that was due to their economic situation deteriorating. Even though they had gained some things after World War I and the economy was doing pretty good because there wasn't a whole lot of competition, they had invested the profits very poorly during the decade of the 20s and therefore became more and more in debt and had a worse economic situation than they had expected. So the military saw taking aggressive action as a way to remedy that. We talked about the attack on Manchuria in 1931 in Chapter 5, and this was something that showed the failure of the League of Nations. But from Japan's point of view, invading Manchuria was a way to not only gain more territory and become more of a power in the Pacific, but it also had economic reasons too. The problem was it was a military move, not a government move, and that was something that really alarmed the U.S., was that the military could step out from the government and take control of a situation and do something that the government had never even planned to do. This was something deliberately planned by the army itself. Not only did the Japanese take Manchuria and pretty much just disregard what the League of Nations told them to do in giving it back, they also took more land. If you look at the top of 135, they took an area called Jehol, which is the north of the Great Wall, west of Manchuria, and east of Mongolia. So they even went farther than just Manchuria. They left the League of Nations, and so they were definitely on a quest to become more and more powerful in the Pacific, even if that meant deteriorating relations with the West. And if you look at the top of 135, you can see that relations between Western countries and Japan declined for several reasons. There was a bombing in Shanghai in 1932, the year after the Manchuria issue, that was definitely of concern because it was an action taken by the Japanese. There was also the fact that Japan left the League of Nations after the Leighton Report that took over a year to complete, which was a failure of the League, but Japan just up and left the League. And finally, that in 1934, Japan showed that it was unwilling to continue disarmament negotiations. They pulled out of their Washington Naval Treaty Agreement that they had committed to, and they refused to attend any other conference. So to many countries in the West, like Britain and France and the United States, Japan was starting to become more of an enemy, whereas they had been an ally during World War I. We've talked about the Sino-Japanese War as the fact that it interrupted Phase 1 of the Chinese Civil War, and it was the issue that was basically the intermission between Phase 1 and Phase 2 of the Chinese Civil War. In 1933, which was just a couple years after the Manchuria attack and 1 year after the Shanghai bombing, there was supposedly this truce that was signed with the Chinese nationalists, which we know were under the control of Jiang Jiechi. And basically this bought a little bit of peace for the Chinese. They were in the process of battling the communists led by Mao during those years. But in 1936, within the country of Japan, there was a failed military coup. And because it failed, the military felt a need to try to exercise more and more power. This was also something seen as the fact that the government was really not in control of the military and that the military could take action without permission of the government. So in July of 1937 is when the Japanese decided to invade China again. They had had that Sino-Japanese War in 1894. They had taken Manchuria in 1931. They supposedly had signed this truce, but clearly you can see that the Japanese were set on taking China, or as much of it as possible, that it was definitely an end goal for them. So they clashed at the Marco Polo Bridge in Beijing, and I'd like you to look at the sidebar on page 135, the yellow sidebar, that gives a little bit of background of the Marco Polo incident, and it's saying that the Chinese soldiers fired on the Japanese. It's easy to understand why they did so. I mean, for many years prior to this, the Chinese had been subjected to Japanese invasions and basically being humiliated at the hands of the Japanese. So the fact that Chinese soldiers fired on the Japanese would be easy to understand, but the Japanese used that supposed attack upon their soldiers as an excuse to broaden their attack on mainland China, and therefore they brought over many more troops and air units into the country of China to have a broader attack on the country itself. Obviously, this would be something that was going to be a huge issue leading up to World War II. If you look on 135 right above the purple box, the problem with Japan invading China in this second Sino-Japanese War was that they really had no clear idea of how it was going to end. They knew how they were going to enter it and what they were going to do initially, but they really had no idea of how it was going to play out or how they were going to end it, which is kind of similar, if you think of it, to our involvement in Vietnam. I mean, we had a goal of what we wanted by taking the communist threat out of South Vietnam, but we really had no clear strategy of how we were going to achieve that goal and pull our troops out. So there's some comparisons here between this Sino-Japanese War and the Vietnam War. The reason why the Japanese, not only did they want China for territorial expansion, but they were out to gain an empire economically as well. In order to be successful in China, they needed to have as many raw materials as possible to wage war. And the fact that you would have to have a lot of men that needed supplies and resources to battle the Chinese. China is a fairly large country geographically, and so the Japanese would have to continually supply resources to their men. And so this was going to be something that would bring the Japanese into conflict with the U.S., who was a partner for trade that the Japanese used, specifically for things like oil, which you would need to fuel ships to go to China and to keep other equipment going. And the U.S. was very alarmed at the fact that the Japanese were out to make this empire. I mean, we were already having deteriorating relations with the Japanese because of what they had done with Manchuria and pulling out of the League, even though we weren't members of the League. We just kind of saw the Japanese as becoming more and more aggressive and threatening our interest. We didn't want the Japanese to take China because China was an interest to us for trade, and we didn't want that to be taken away from us. It was a sphere of influence for us. So you can see that this would definitely bring us into conflict with the Japanese, the fact that they were going to continue waging this war against the Chinese. So even though we didn't like the fact that the Japanese were bent on waging war across China, and that was going to be a threat to our interests with China, we still didn't necessarily want to get involved in a full-out conflict in Asia in 1937. During those years, we were suffering from the Great Depression, as was the rest of the world, so the British and the French didn't want to do anything either, as they had not done with the Manchuria incident. So when the Japanese became more and more aggressive and broadened their attack on China, we just simply issued a verbal condemnation because we didn't want to get involved. It's kind of similar to what Chamberlain was doing with Hitler, just really not taking any hardline action and maybe just issuing a complaint or disagreement. And that's what we had done or that's what the League did with Italy and the Abyssinian crisis. Nobody really wanted in the 30s to take any type of hard action in an area where they were not directly threatened, because it would cost money and you would need resources which most countries didn't have in the 1930s. So just issuing a verbal condemnation just gave the Japanese the message that they could continue this action towards the Chinese. But you can also see, if you look at the top of 136, that not only were the Japanese being aggressive against the Chinese and expanding the war, they also sank some of our own battleships and attacked them. You can see the USS Panay was attacked in Nanjing when they did the so-called rape of Nanjing, which is where the Chinese had to move their capital to. And basically you can see here that we accepted an apology from the Japanese and some compensation, but our battleship had been attacked and sunk, and all we did was accept a verbal apology. So that shows that we weren't really wanting to take hard action at first. I want to show you a picture of the USS Panay. This was the boat that was sunk by the Japanese forces. This was the American battleship, and basically we didn't do much about it. The reason why I have this picture, this is from my grandmother. Her father was stationed in China during the years of the Chinese Civil War Phase 1 and throughout some of the 30s as well. And so he had some of these pictures with his other mementos that he kept from those years. So I have a direct connection to this event here, and he remembers, my grandmother telling me anyways, that he remembers the fact that this should have been an outrage and it wasn't. But the next year, 1938, we started to become a little bit more hard in our approach to the Japanese, because we started giving aid to China so that they could fight the Japanese. So we weren't necessarily jumping in ourselves yet, but we were trying to assist the Chinese in their struggles. The following year, 1939, we then canceled a very important trade agreement that we had set up with Japan called the Commerce and Navigation Treaty. This would be something that would be devastating to the Japanese if they could not continue abiding by this treaty, which benefited them up to this time. From 1937 on, basically the military completely took over the government. We saw that the military acted unilaterally up here in Manchuria, and from the time that Japan opened up to the West, the military was improving and becoming a more dominant feature in the life of Japan. So, but this point on, they completely took over the government, and a lot of historians therefore use that as the reason why we can't completely blame the Emperor Hirohito for any of the actions taken by the Japanese in World War II, because the military had pretty much wiped out the government and he was just a figurehead. There's others that say that he was working with the military. So that's another debate for another time, but you can see here that the military was now in control. The following year, 1938, which was the same year that we gave money to China and aid so that they could continue fighting the Japanese, Japan announced a very propaganda-like, almost a Hitler-like tactic here, something that they called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. And you can see it mentioned at the top of 136 above the purple student study section box, that this was basically going to be the idea of supposedly cooperation between China, Manchukuo, which was Manchuria, and Japan. Now, how that can be considered cooperation is I have no idea, because the Japanese were at war with China. So how they were going to say they were cooperating with China is beyond me. But they went on further to say that they were going to be the model state that led other states in Asia into this new order that was going to be established, that they were going to be working together, but that Japan was going to be the leader of this group of nations. So it sounded very positive. I mean, it painted the Japanese as, you know, really trying to work together with other countries. And they actually, which is interesting, if you can see on 136, that they compared what the Americans were doing in Latin America to what they were doing. I mean, if you know much about U.S. history, in the early 1900s, we had gotten involved in many cases in Latin America with Teddy Roosevelt's idea of the big stick policy, and then from after that, things like dollar diplomacy, where we kind of saw ourselves as the leader of the Western Hemisphere, leading other nations to prosperity. So Japan actually painted it and compared it to the United States so that they wouldn't look as bad. But it was the idea that Japan was going to take over East Asia. And then furthermore, they had a conference in 1940, which was sort of similar to Hitler's meeting that he had where the Hossbach Memorandum was produced, and historians consider this meeting with the Japanese and their military leaders as similar to what Hitler had with his group of military leaders that was recorded with the Hossbach Memorandum as clear evidence that the Japanese were planning war. But in this conference, you can see that Japan thought that they should establish itself in other countries like Indochina, which was made up of countries like Cambodia and Vietnam, Thailand, Burma, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. So they had their sights set on all of these places and the Chinese. So clearly the Japanese were outlining plans for war. If they thought that they were going to establish themselves, really the only way that you can do that is by force, because these countries aren't necessarily going to give themselves up to the Japanese. And especially with the Chinese being at war with them, there was definitely no cooperation. It was just painted that way for propaganda. So what we'll be looking at after this is the actual cause of the war in the Pacific, where the Japanese end up bombing Pearl Harbor, which brings the United States officially into World War II.